Silence was the only language Elara knew. It was a heavy cloak she had worn for a decade, ever since the fire that stole her parents and scorched the words from her throat. In the bustling, brutal kitchens of Lord Vorlag, her muteness was not a tragedy but a defect, a flaw that made her less than human. She was a ghost at the hearth, a shadow scrubbing pots, her existence measured in the clatter of dropped spoons and the harsh rebukes she could not answer. The other servants, a pack of scrawny dogs fighting for scraps of kindness, saw her silence as arrogance. They shoved her, stole her meager rations, and whispered curses she could feel like stones against her back. Her world was a cage of smells and textures. The greasy scent of roasting boar, the sharp sting of lye on her chapped hands, the gritty floor beneath her thin sleeping palate. These sensations were her vocabulary, the only things that spoke to her in the suffocating quiet. The inciting incident arrived not with a bang, but with the clank of iron-shod hooves on the Bailey stones. A royal tax collector, but he was not here for coin. He came for flesh. An ancient pact, a tribute owed to the Shadow King of the North, Lycan. A king spoken of only in hushed, terrified whispers. A beast, they said. A monster who ruled a kingdom of stone and ice. Lord Vorlag, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cowardice, paled at the decree. The king demanded 10 servants, 10 souls to be fed to his frozen, haunted castle. Panic rippled through the keep. Mothers hid their daughters. Young men suddenly developed convenient limps. But Lord Vorlag's eyes, small and piggy, found Elara in the corner of the great hall. She was polishing silver, her reflection a warped, silent smudge on the surface of a goblet. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He saw a solution. A way to rid himself of the useless, silent girl who haunted his halls like a bad omen. She was a broken thing, of no value to him. Perhaps the Monster King would have a use for her. The transaction was swift and merciless. Her name was called, a harsh bark of sound that made her flinch. 2 guards seized her arms, their gauntlets cold and unforgiving against her skin. She did not struggle. What was the point? She had no voice to scream, no one to scream for. Her entire life had been a series of hands pushing her, pulling her, discarding her. This was just another pair of hands, another destination she did not choose. She was shoved into a line with 9 others. Their faces were masks of terror. Tears streamed down their cheeks, quiet whimpers escaping their lips. Elara alone was still. Her face was a placid lake, but beneath the surface, a storm of fear raged. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited more pain. Lord Vorlag stood before the royal collector, gesturing to the line of human tribute. "A fine selection," he said, his voice slick with false pride. "Strong. Healthy. That one is mute," he added, as if pointing out a chipped piece of pottery. "But she is a hard worker and causes no trouble." The collector, a man with a face like a weathered stone, did not even glance at her. He merely grunted. His duty fulfilled. The pact was honored. The Shadow King would have his tithe. Elara was pushed toward a grim, black carriage. She took one last look at the keep that had been her prison. She felt nothing. No sadness. No regret. She was simply trading one cage for another. As the heavy door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness, the sobs of the others filled the small space. Elara closed her eyes. She did not cry. The tears, like her words, were trapped deep inside, frozen in a silent well of grief. The wheels of the carriage began to turn, a mournful groan that sounded like a funeral dirge. They were rolling north, towards the shadows, towards the beast who wore a crown. She wondered, with a strange detachment, what a monster would do with a blessed girl who could not even scream. The journey north was a descent into winter's heart. The rolling green hills of her former life gave way to jagged, snow-dusted peaks that clawed at a bruised purple sky. The air grew thin and sharp, tasting of ice and ancient stone. Alara and the others were huddled together for warmth, their fear a palpable, shivering thing in the cramped carriage. They spoke in whispers of the Shadow King, Lycan. They said his heart was made of ice, that he feasted on the marrow of his enemies, that his castle was carved from the bones of a dead mountain. She listened, the stories painting a terrifying portrait in her mind. A beast of myth and legend. A primal force of nature wearing the guise of a king. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was a familiar companion. Fear had been her shadow for as long as she could remember. Finally, the carriage shuddered to a halt. The door was wrenched open, flooding the darkness with a blinding gray light. A guard, clad in black armor that seemed to drink the very air around him, barked a single word. Out. Alara stepped onto frozen ground and looked up. The whispered tales had not done it justice. The castle was not carved from a mountain, it was the mountain. Black spires of obsidian pierced the clouds, impossibly sharp and cruel against the pale sky. It was a fortress of breathtaking, terrifying beauty, a monument to power and isolation. There were no welcoming banners, no bustling courtyard, only a profound, oppressive silence that seemed to soak into her bones. It was a silence deeper than her own, ancient and heavy with unspoken sorrows. For the first time, she felt her own quietness was a small, fragile thing in the face of this monumental stillness. The other servants were led away, their whimpers swallowed by the vastness of the stone halls. Alara was guided down a separate corridor by a stern-faced woman in a severe gray dress. The woman, whose name she later learned was Helga, the head housekeeper, did not speak to her. She simply prodded her along as if she were livestock. The culture of this grim-faced warriors, with old scars and haunted eyes, patrolled the halls. Servants moved with a silent, fearful efficiency, their gazes always fixed on the floor. Laughter was a foreign currency here, and smiles were rarer than the sun. She was taken to a large, cold chamber where a handful of other new arrivals were gathered. A girl with sharp, jealous eyes and a cruel twist to her mouth seemed to be in charge. "I am Seraphina," the girl announced, her voice dripping with self-importance. "You will do as I say. Here, you are nothing, less than nothing. You are the king's property." Seraphina's eyes landed on Alara, lingering on her still, quiet form. "What's wrong with you? Cat got your tongue?" she sneered. The other girls giggled nervously. Alara simply stared back, her expression unreadable. Her silence, which had been a shield for so long, now felt like a target painted on her chest. The ritual of debasement began. They were ordered to strip. The cold air was a physical blow against her skin, a raw and brutal exposure. Alara's scars, thin white lines that crisscrossed her back from the fire so long ago, were laid bare for all to see. Seraphina's lip curled in disgust. They were scrubbed with coarse brushes and harsh soap until their skin was red and raw. It was an attempt to wash away their former lives, to erase any trace of who they had been. They were then given drab gray uniforms, identical and shapeless. They were no longer individuals. They were cogs in this cold, dark machine. Humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow, but Alara had been fed it her whole life. She endured it with the same silent fortitude she had always used. She let the shame wash over her and through her, leaving her hollowed out and empty, a vessel waiting to be filled with whatever new horrors this place had in store. Later that day, the summons came. "The king will see you now," Helga announced, her voice devoid of emotion. Terror, sharp and electrifying, shot through Alara. This was it. The moment she would face the beast, the monster from the stories. She was led through winding, torch-lit corridors to a pair of massive obsidian doors. The guards pushed them open, revealing the throne room. It was a cavernous space, dominated by shadows and the sheer scale of the architecture. At the far end, upon a throne that looked like it was forged from solidified night, sat the king, King Lycan. He was not a monster. Not in the way the stories had described. He was terrifying, yes, but it was a terrifying beauty. He was tall and powerfully built, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes the color of a winter storm. A jagged scar ran from his temple down his jaw, a stark white line against his tanned skin. Power radiated from him like heat from a furnace, a primal, untamed energy that filled the entire room. He looked bored as he dismissed the other servants one by one, with a flick of his wrist or a low growl. His gaze was dismissive, as if they were insects beneath his notice. Then, his eyes fell on Alara. And for the first time, he stilled. The boredom vanished, replaced by an unnerving, intense focus. His stormy gray eyes roamed over her, not with lust or contempt, but with a strange, searching quality. It felt as if he were looking past her skin, past her bones, and into the silent, broken places of her soul. She stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could not look away. It was like being stared down by a wolf, an apex predator who held her life in the palm of his hand. He rose from his throne in a single fluid movement and descended the dais. He stopped a few feet from her, his sheer size and presence overwhelming. The air crackled with tension. "You," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated through the stone floor. It was not a question. It was a claim. He circled her slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. He saw the defiance warring with the fear in her eyes. He saw the unbroken spirit behind the silent facade. He stopped in front of her again. "The others are for the kitchens and the stables," he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "You are for the grove." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her trembling in the vast, empty throne room. The grove. She had no idea what it was, but she knew one thing with chilling certainty. She had been chosen, singled out by the monster. And she did not know if it was a death sentence or something far, far worse. The grove was a place of ghosts. It was a vast, glass-domed conservatory at the heart of the stone castle, a desperate attempt to cage a piece of the living world. But it was dying. The ancient trees, with bark like wrinkled gray skin, were skeletal and bare. The ground was a carpet of brown, desiccated leaves. The air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten things. It was a garden of sorrow, a perfect reflection of the kingdom and the king who ruled it. This was to be Alara's domain. Her unique role, her solitary confinement. Helga had led her here, her expression a mixture of pity and fear. No one enters the grove but the king, she had warned. And now, you. Do not fail him. Alara was given simple tools. A watering can, a small trowel, a pair of shears. She was left alone in the cathedral of dead trees. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of the castle. It was a grieving silence, heavy with the memory of life. She walked the withered paths, her fingers trailing over the dry, brittle bark of a once mighty oak. She felt a pang of empathy for this place. It was trapped, suffocating, unable to cry out its pain. Just like her. She didn't know the first thing about gardening, but she knew about neglect. She knew about being left to wither in the dark. So, she started with the simplest act of kindness she could think of. She began to clear the dead leaves. Her work was slow, methodical. She did not rush. She treated each fallen leaf with a strange reverence, as if it were a memory she was laying to rest. She pulled the choking weeds from the base of the trees, her small hands working gently in the compacted soil. She found a small, clogged spring in the center of the grove, and she spent an entire day clearing the rocks and debris until a trickle of clean, cold water began to flow again. She filled her watering can and began to tend to the thirstiest-looking roots, her movements a silent prayer for life. King Lycan stood in the shadows of a stone archway, hidden from her view. He had watched her for hours. He had expected her to be clumsy, or fearful, or to simply give up. He had not expected this quiet, determined grace. He watched her press her palm against the trunk of a great, dying willow, her eyes closed. He saw her shoulders relax, a strange peace settling over her. He couldn't explain it, but he could almost feel it from across the grove. A faint warmth, a whisper of hope in the desolate air. His curse was tied to this grove. As it withered, so did his spirit. As it died, the darkness inside him grew stronger, colder. For centuries, his ancestors had tended it, but under his reign, it had begun to fail. No gardener, no mystic, no scholar had been able to halt the decay. He had brought her here on a whim, a desperate, illogical impulse, driven by the defiant spark he'd seen in her eyes. He had expected nothing. Days turned into a week. Alara's routine became the rhythm of her life. She would rise before dawn, break her fast with a piece of stale bread, and then retreat to the sanctuary of the grove until dusk. She spoke to the plants in her own silent way, encouraging them, tending to their wounds. And then, a miracle. A tiny, green shoot pushed its way through the cracked earth near the newly cleared spring. It was a fragile, tender thing, almost impossibly vibrant against the sea of brown and gray. Alara saw it and fell to her knees, her heart swelling with a fierce protective joy. She cupped her hands around it, as if to shield it from the sorrow of the world. A single tear, the first she had shed in years, escaped her eye and fell onto the soil beside the new life. From his hiding place, Lycan saw it too. He felt a jolt, a flicker of warmth in the icy prison of his chest. It was a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. Hope. Her perceived defect, her silence was her strength here. She did not try to command the grove, or analyze it, or force it to bend to her will. She simply listened to its silent suffering. She communed with it. She was healing it with her quiet, unwavering compassion. That night, he broke his own rule. He stepped out of the shadows. Alara was sitting by the spring, watching over the small green shoot as if it were a sleeping child. She heard the crunch of his boots on the gravel path, and her head snapped up, her body tensing with fear. It was him, the king. Bathed in moonlight, he looked less like a man, and more like a god of the night. All sharp angles and imposing shadows. She scrambled to her feet, ready to bow, to flee. But he held up a hand, a gesture that was not threatening, but calming. He did not speak. He walked to the spring and knelt, his gaze fixed on the tiny green sprout. He looked at it for a long time, his stern face unreadable. Then, he looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes, no judgment, only a raw, aching curiosity. He saw the dirt under her fingernails, the smudge of soil on her cheek. He saw the weary strength in her posture. A routine was born in that moment. Every night, after the castle was asleep, he would come to the grove. He would not demand she speak. He would not ask questions she could not answer. He would simply sit on a cold stone bench, a silent sentinel, and watch her work. Sometimes, he would bring her things. A piece of fruit from his own plate. A thicker cloak to ward off the chill. Small, unspoken kindnesses that were more eloquent than any poem. She, in turn, began to leave things for him on the bench. A perfect, smooth stone she had found. A single, resilient winter rose that had bloomed against all odds. These were their conversations. A secret language of gestures and gifts. In the quiet solitude of the dying grove, surrounded by the ghosts of what once was, two silent, broken souls began to find each other. The king, cursed with a power he couldn't control, and the mute servant girl who held the power to heal him in her quiet, gentle hands. Their bond was a fragile green shoot, pushing its way through the frozen ground of their loneliness, and neither of them knew if it would be strong enough to survive the coming winter. The grove began to breathe again. Under Ilara's patient care, more green shoots appeared. Tentative buds formed on the skeletal branches of the ancient trees. The air, once stagnant with decay, now carried the faint, sweet scent of damp earth and new life. And as the grove healed, so did something inside its king. The change in lichen was subtle at first. The lines of tension around his eyes seemed to soften. The oppressive aura of cold fury that always surrounded him lessened, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. The castle staff noticed it. They whispered that the beast was being tamed, though they did not know how or by whom. His nightly visits to the grove became the anchor of Ilara's existence. The fear she initially felt in his presence had slowly, miraculously, transformed into a sense of peace. He was a constant, a solid shadow in her periphery. His silence did not mock hers, it complemented it. One night, he broke their unspoken pact of quiet. She was tending to a patch of moss, her fingers tracing its velvety texture, when his low voice startled her. "My grandmother used to say that this grove was the heart of the kingdom," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That as long as it thrived, our people would be strong." Ilara looked up at him, surprised. He was not looking at her, but at the great willow tree in the center of the garden. Its branches were showing the first signs of green. She was the last one who could make it sing. He continued, a melancholic note in his tone. "After she died, it began to fade. When I took the throne, the decay quickened. The elders called it the king's curse. My darkness was poisoning the heart of my own land." He finally turned his gaze to her, and the vulnerability she saw there stole her breath. Behind the fearsome ruler, behind the monster of the whispers, was a man chained to a sorrow he could not escape. A profound loneliness radiated from him, a solitude so deep it mirrored her own. She felt a sudden, powerful urge to comfort him, but she had no words. Instead, she stood, walked to the winter rose bush, and carefully snipped its most perfect bloom. She approached him slowly, cautiously, as one would a wounded wolf. She held it out to him. An offering. A silent message. I see your pain. You are not alone. He stared at the rose in her hand, then at her face. His large, calloused fingers brushed against hers as he took it. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. The air between them crackled, suddenly charged with an energy that had nothing to do with curses or gardens. It was a pull, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The mate bond. She had heard the older servants speak of it, a fated connection between alphas and their chosen partners, as mythic and unreal as the stories of the king himself. But this was no myth. It was real, and it was happening to her. A mute, scarred servant girl. His stormy eyes widened slightly, and she knew he felt it too. He looked at her, not as a king looks at a servant, but as a man looks at the missing piece of his soul. From that night on, their connection deepened. Their silent conversations grew more profound. She would show him a new leaf, and he would understand her joy. He would touch a withered branch, and she would feel his despair. They were two halves of a whole, speaking a language that transcended words. In the grove, she was not the defective girl. She was a healer, a life-bringer. And he was not the fearsome Shadow King. He was just Lycan, a man burdened by a crown and a curse. But their secret sanctuary could not remain hidden forever. Shadows have a way of attracting other shadows. Lord Valerius, the king's uncle and most trusted advisor, was a man carved from ambition and deceit. He had watched his nephew's transformation with growing alarm. Lycan's cold, ruthless pragmatism had always been a tool Valerius could manipulate for his own ends. This new softness, this strange obsession with a mute servant girl, was a threat. Valerius believed in the old ways. He believed power was maintained through fear and brutality, the very traditions that Lycan's father had upheld. The healing of the grove, and by extension the king, heralded a change he could not afford. His spies had been watching. They told him of the nightly meetings. They told him of the king's smiles, rare as dragon's teeth, reserved only for the silent girl. And then, there was Seraphina. Her jealousy had festered into a poisonous hatred. She had been assigned to the royal wing, hoping to catch the king's eye herself. Instead, she was forced to watch as the broken, silent girl captured the attention of the most powerful man in the kingdom. It was an insult she could not bear. Valerius found in Seraphina a willing and venomous pawn. He cornered her in a dimly lit corridor, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "The king is enchanted," he hissed, his eyes glittering like chips of ice. "This creature, this nothing, has bewitched him. Danger to the stability of this kingdom." Seraphina's heart pounded with a vicious thrill. "What would you have me do, my lord?" Valerius smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his severe face. "The grove is the source of her power over him. If the grove were to suffer a relapse, if it were to seem as though she, in her ignorance, had poisoned it, the king's enchantment would be broken. He would see her for what she truly is." He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. It was heavy, filled with a dark, gnarled root. Nightshade root, he whispered. Crush it to a powder and sprinkle it in the central spring. It is slow acting. By the time the grove begins to blacken, you will be long gone from the scene of the crime. Seraphina's fingers closed around the pouch. This was her chance. A chance to destroy her rival and earn the favor of a powerful lord. A chance to restore the proper order of things, where silent, useless girls knew their place. That night, as Alara slept, exhausted from her day's work, a different shadow crept into the moonlit grove. Seraphina moved quickly, her heart a frantic drum of malice and fear. She found the spring, the source of all the new life, and emptied the contents of the pouch into the clear water. The dark powder dissolved, leaving no trace. It was a silent, insidious poison, a betrayal that would shatter the fragile peace that had been so carefully nurtured in the heart of the dying garden. The trap was set, and Alara, who had finally found a place where her silence was understood, was about to be silenced forever. The decay began at the heart of the grove and spread outwards like a black frost. The vibrant green shoot by the spring, Alara's first small victory, was the first to succumb. It shriveled, turning a sickly, venomous black overnight. When Alara entered the grove at dawn, a scream built in her throat, silent and agonizing. The new leaves on the willow tree were curled and brittle. The moss that had been so soft and green was now a dry, gray patch of dust. The sweet smell of life had been replaced by the foul stench of corruption. Panic seized her. She ran to the spring, her heart hammering with a dreadful premonition. The water looked clear, but she could feel it. A wrongness, a sickness that pulsed from the very stones. She plunged her hands in, as if she could physically pull the poison out, but it was useless. The damage was done. She worked frantically all day, trying to undo what had happened. She pruned the blackened leaves, her shears clicking a desperate rhythm. She tried to flush the spring with clean water from a rain barrel, but the blight was too deep, too pervasive. The grove was dying, faster and more violently than before, and with it, the king's light was extinguished. Lycan felt the grove's agony as a physical blow. A brutal, icy fist clenched around his heart, and the cold darkness he had fought so hard to keep at bay came rushing back, a tidal wave of despair and rage. The curse was reasserting its dominion, stronger than ever. He stormed into the grove, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He saw the blackening leaves, the dying plants, and he saw her, on her knees by the spring, her hands covered in mud and her face streaked with tears. His heart, already constricted with the curse's return, fractured. He had allowed himself to hope. He had allowed himself to believe in this silent, gentle girl. He had thought she was the cure. But here was the proof. She was the poison. What have you done? He roared, his voice echoing through the dying trees. It was the voice of the Shadow King, the beast of the stories, and it made Alara flinch as if struck. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. She shook her head desperately, trying to convey her innocence, but her silence was a wall between them. How could she explain? How could she defend herself? Before she could even try, Lord Valerius appeared at the king's side, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice grave, "we found this in the girls' sleeping quarters." He held out a small, empty leather pouch. Alara recognized it instantly. She had seen Seraphina carrying one just like it. Valerius opened his other hand. In his palm lay a small, gnarled piece of nightshade root that had accidentally been left behind. The castle apothecary identified the poison in the spring, Valerius continued, his voice laced with sorrowful accusation. It is nightshade, a root known only to the hedge witches of the southern provinces. Where would a simple servant girl learn of such things? Unless she is not what she seems. The pieces clicked into place in Lycan's mind, a perfect, damning picture painted by his uncle's careful words. The girl was from the south. She had bewitched him. She was an assassin, sent to strike at his one vulnerability, the grove. Her gentleness had been a lie, her kindness a weapon. The betrayal was a white-hot agony, more painful than the curse itself. The pull of the mate bond, which had been a warm, vibrant song between them, was now a screeching, dissonant chord of pain and rejection. No, he snarled, the word ripped from his throat. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to the bond, to the fates who had been so cruel as to give him a glimpse of salvation, only to snatch it away. Alara could only stare, her world collapsing around her. She looked from the king's tormented face to Valerius's triumphant smirk, and she understood. She had been framed. She tried to stand, to reach for him, to somehow make him see the truth in her eyes, but he recoiled from her as if she were a serpent. By the laws of this kingdom, Valerius intoned, the penalty for high treason and the use of dark magic is death. Lycan's jaw clenched. Death. The thought of it, the thought of her life being extinguished, was unbearable. Even now, betrayed and enraged, he could not bring himself to give that order. No, he said again, his voice cracking like ice. Death is too merciful. He looked at her, his stormy eyes now glacial and empty. All the warmth, all the vulnerability she had seen in him, was gone. He had locked it away, buried it under layers of pain and kingly duty. She will be banished, he decreed, his voice echoing with the cold finality of a slamming tomb door. Cast out into the Deadlands. Let the wasteland claim the life she tried to steal from this kingdom. The Deadlands. A barren, lifeless expanse to the east from which no one ever returned. It was a death sentence, just a slower, more cruel one. 2 guards seized her arms. This time, she struggled. She fought with a desperate animal strength, her eyes locked on Lycan's. Please, her gaze screamed. Don't do this. Look at me. See me. But he turned his back on her. He could not bear to look at her, because if he did, he knew his resolve would shatter. He had to be the king. He had to enforce his own harsh laws. He had to cut out the poison, even if it meant cutting out his own heart. As the guards dragged her from the grove, she saw Seraphina watching from the corridor, a flicker of malicious triumph in her eyes. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. Alara was cast out of the castle gates with nothing but the thin clothes on her back. The heavy gates boomed shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality. She was alone, rejected, and banished, facing a frozen wasteland. The man she had, against all logic, begun to love, believed she was a monster. And in the castle, the king's vulnerability was complete. With his heart broken and his only hope for a cure gone, Lycan was weakened, isolated. Lord Valerius's true plan was now in motion. The poison in the grove was just the first step. The real target had always been the throne. The Deadlands were a monochrome nightmare. Gray sky bled into gray, cracked earth. The wind was a razor, slicing through Alara's thin tunic, its mournful howl the only sound for miles. This was a place where life came to die. For days, she walked. Survival was a primal instinct, a stubborn flicker of life that refused to be extinguished. She found scrawny, bitter roots to chew on and drank from brackish pools of melted snow. At night, she huddled in the shallow caves of rock formations, shivering. The cold, a living entity that sought to leach the warmth from her bones. But as her body weakened, something within her began to awaken. The silence of the Deadlands was different. It was not empty. It was listening. The land itself seemed to be whispering to her, its ancient sorrows seeping into her consciousness. One evening, huddled by a pathetic fire made of dried scrub, she was startled by a sound. The crunch of boots on gravel. Her heart leaped into her throat. A beast? A scavenger? A figure emerged from the gloom, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in the black armor of the Shadow King's royal guard. It was Commander Kale, Lycan's most loyal second-in-command. A man known for his unwavering integrity and fierce devotion to the throne. She scrambled back, expecting a blade. Instead, he stopped a respectful distance away and removed his helmet. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a troubled light. "I did not believe it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I have served the king my entire life. I know Lord Valerius. I have seen the way his ambition poisons everything he touches." He had followed her, acting on a gut feeling, a soldier's intuition that the official story was a lie. He had watched her survive, had seen her quiet resilience. He offered her a water skin and a piece of dried meat. She took them, her hands trembling. It was the first act of kindness she had received since the king had turned his back on her. Valerius plans to make his move during the blood moon ceremony, Kale explained, his voice urgent. It is an ancient ritual where the king must renew his oath to the land. It is a moment of great power, but also of great vulnerability. With the grove weakened, the king will be at his most exposed. Valerius has been forging alliances, promising a return to the brutal ways of Lycan's father. He will strike then. The ceremony was in 2 days. 2 days to cross the Deadlands and get back to the castle. It was impossible. As Kael spoke, Alara's eyes were drawn to a small, hardy plant growing at the base of a rock behind him. It was a plant she recognized from the deepest, oldest part of her memory. A memory from before the fire. A memory of her mother's voice, singing to the herbs in her garden. Kingsfoil. A voice whispered in her mind. The cure for nightshade. The knowledge was there, innate and absolute. She pointed to the plant, her eyes wide with urgency. Kale followed her gaze, frowning in confusion. She tugged on his arm, her desperation palpable. She pointed to the plant, then made a crushing motion with her hands, then pointed back in the direction of the castle. Understanding dawned on his face. "This is the antidote?" She nodded vigorously. But it wasn't just an antidote. The land was telling her more. This plant, combined with her own unique essence, could do more than just cure the grove. It could sever the curse itself. And with that realization came another, more terrifying one. The trauma of the fire had not just stolen her voice. It had sealed her power. Her muteness was a lock on a cage, holding back a force she never knew she possessed. She was the last of the Grove Singers, a line of women whose voices could command the very life force of the earth. To save Lycan, she would have to break the seal. She would have to find her voice. The return journey was a desperate race against time. Kale pushed them relentlessly, his warrior's stamina matched only by Alara's fierce determination. The fate of the man she loved, and the kingdom he ruled, rested on her silent shoulders. They arrived at the castle, under the eerie, crimson light of the rising blood moon. Kale used his authority to get them through a postern gate, sneaking through the shadowed corridors they both knew so well. The castle was abuzz, the air thick with anticipation for the ceremony. The throne room was packed with the kingdom's lords and ladies, all dressed in their finest. At the center of the room, on a dais before the throne, stood King Lycan. He looked pale and drawn, the curse a visible weight upon him. The darkness clung to him like a shroud. Lord Valerius stood at his side, a venomous serpent disguised as a loyal advisor. "The time has come," Valerius announced, his voice ringing with false piety. "The king will renew his bond with the land." Lycan drew a ceremonial dagger, its obsidian blade gleaming in the torchlight. He was meant to slice his palm and let his blood fall onto a bowl of earth from the grove, a symbolic act of sacrifice and renewal. But as Lycan raised the blade, Valerius made his move. He drew a wicked, curved dagger of his own, its blade coated in a sickly green poison. He lunged, not at the king's hand, but at his heart. "The land demands a stronger king." Valerius shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of triumph. Cale bellowed a warning and drew his sword, but he was too far away. Time seemed to slow down. Ilara saw the poisoned blade arcing towards Lycan's chest. She saw the shock and betrayal on Lycan's face. She did not think. She acted. She burst from the shadows where Cale had hidden them, a small, gray figure moving like a bolt of lightning. She threw herself in front of Lycan, a human shield. But she was not the target. And a shield was not what was needed. Healing was. Valerius's blade sliced across Lycan's arm, a deep, vicious cut. The green poison instantly began to spread, black veins crawling up the king's skin. He cried out, staggering back, the curse and the poison a double assault on his life force. Ilara stood before him, her back to Valerius, her eyes locked on Lycan's. She held the king's foil crushed in her hand. It was not enough. She had to break the seal. She had to shatter the cage of silence she had lived in for a decade. She reached deep inside herself, past the fear, past the trauma, past the memory of smoke and screams. She searched for the voice that had been stolen from her. She opened her mouth. For a moment, only a choked gasp came out. Then, she focused on Lycan, on the bond that still thrummed between them, weak but unbroken. She poured all her love, all her pain, all her desperate hope into that single point of connection. And then she sang. It was not a word. It was a note. A single, pure tone that resonated with the very stones of the castle. It was the sound of spring thaw, of the first green shoot, of life itself. A wave of emerald and gold light erupted from her, washing over the throne room. The light slammed into Lycan, and the black veins of poison receded, sizzling away into nothing. The darkness of the curse was driven back, shrinking from her song like a creature of the night from the dawn. Color returned to his face, strength to his limbs. Her voice swelled, growing stronger, weaving a melody of healing and restoration. The torches in the room burned brighter. The withered flowers in the lady's hair seemed to perk up. The very air felt clean and new. Valerius stared, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. His dark magic was powerless against this pure, primal life force. "Impossible," he whispered. The court was stunned into absolute silence. The mute servant girl was singing, and her song was a miracle. Lycan stared at her, his eyes wide with awe and a dawning, soul-shattering understanding. He saw the truth. He saw her sacrifice. He saw the depth of her power and her love. His choice was instantaneous. It was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. "Cale," he roared, his voice clear and powerful once more. "Seize that traitor." As Kale and the loyal guards subdued the sputtering, "Valerius!" Lycan stepped forward. He ignored the gasping court, the whispers, the chaos. He had eyes only for her. Her song softened, the last note fading into the stunned silence. She swayed, the effort of breaking a decade-old seal overwhelming her. He caught her before she could fall, pulling her into his arms. "Elara," he breathed, the first time he had ever said her name. It was a prayer. A vow. Her true identity as a grove singer was revealed not by a proclamation, but by the undeniable magic that had just saved them all. She was not a defective slave. She was the kingdom's salvation, the cure for its cursed king. He held her close, burying his face in her hair. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. In front of his entire court, the fearsome Shadow King made his choice. He chose the broken girl who had made him whole. He chose love over law, and hope over despair. Their bond, once rejected, now flared to life. A brilliant, blinding light that solidified their union for all the world to see. The aftermath of the revelation was swift and decisive. Lord Valerius, stripped of his titles and his dark illusions, was dragged to the dungeons. His co-conspirators, their faces pale with terror in the wake of Elara's miraculous display, were rounded up by Commander Kale and his loyalists. The coup had been shattered not by swords, but by a single, impossible song. But Elara was only dimly aware of the chaos. The world was a blur of sound and light. After a decade of silence, the sudden return of her voice, of her power, was overwhelming. She clung to Lycan, his strong arms the only solid thing in her spinning reality. He swept her up and carried her from the throne room, ignoring the shocked faces of his court. He took her to his private chambers, a place of stark masculine simplicity, dominated by a massive hearth. He laid her gently on a soft fur rug before the fire and knelt beside her. "Elara," he said again, his voice gentle. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch hesitant, as if he were afraid she might break. She looked at him, her eyes still wide with the aftershocks of what she had done. She opened her mouth, wanting to speak, to say his name. "Lycan," she whispered. Her own voice was a foreign sound, raspy from disuse, but clear and steady. The word hung in the air between them, a fragile, beautiful thing. A look of profound relief and joy washed over his face. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "I was a fool," he said, his voice raw with regret. "Blinded by pride and pain. Can you ever forgive me?" She didn't need words for this. She simply squeezed his hand and gave him a small, watery smile. Forgiveness was already there, a deep and abiding truth that had guided her back to him through the Deadlands. They stayed like that for a long time, the firelight dancing on their faces, the silence between them no longer a barrier but a comfortable, shared space. He told her everything about the weight of the crown, the isolation of his curse, the terror he'd felt when he thought she had betrayed him. And she, in her newfound voice, told him of her life. Of the fire, the silence, the cruelty, and the small, stubborn hope that had kept her going. They laid their broken pieces out before each other, and in the warmth of the fire, they began to fit them together. The next day, Lycan called his court to assemble in the throne room once more. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Elara stood beside him, no longer in a drab servant's uniform, but in a simple, elegant gown of deep forest green that he had procured for her. She was nervous, but his hand at the small of her back was a warm, steadying presence. "You bore witness last night to a great betrayal," Lycan began, his voice ringing with kingly authority, "and to a greater miracle." His gaze swept over the assembled lords and ladies, missing nothing. "For too long, this kingdom has been ruled by fear. We have valued brutality over compassion, and power over justice. We have let our own hearts become as cold and hard as the stone of this castle." He turned and looked at Alara, his expression softening into one of profound love and reverence. "This woman," he declared, his voice booming through the hall, "has shown us another way. With her courage, she saved my life. With her song, she has begun to heal our land. She is the last of the Grove Singers, a gift from the old magic we had all but forgotten." A murmur went through the crowd. The Grove Singers were figures of legend, women said to be so in tune with the earth that they could make wastelands bloom. "She is my salvation," Lycan said, his voice dropping to a more personal, intense level. "She is my heart, and she will be my queen." He turned to her, taking both of her hands in his. In front of everyone, he knelt before her. A collective gasp rippled through the court. A king kneeling to a former servant. It was unheard of. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are my mate, my fated one. Will you accept me? Will you rule by my side?" Tears welled in her eyes. The girl who had been considered less than nothing offered up to be queen of the entire kingdom. The girl who had never been allowed a choice was now being given the most important one of all. "Yes," she whispered, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Lycan." He rose, a radiant smile transforming his harsh features. He leaned in, and in a ritual as old as the mountains, he gently bit the juncture of her neck and shoulder. A flash of golden light enveloped them, the mate bond sealing, visible and absolute. A wave of warmth and rightness washed over Alara, a sense of coming home she had never known. He was hers. She was his. Forever. The court erupted in a roar of approval, their fear of the Shadow King replaced by awe for the miracle they had witnessed and the love that was so clearly displayed before them. The age of shadows was over. The age of light had begun. 1 year later, the castle was transformed. Sunlight streamed through newly cleaned windows, illuminating halls that were no longer grim and silent. The sound of laughter could often be heard echoing from the courtyard. The black banners of the Shadow King had been replaced with new ones, bearing the sigil of a black wolf intertwined with a green, leafy vine. The grove was the heart of this transformation. It was a lush, vibrant paradise, teeming with life. Flowers of every color bloomed in profusion, and the great trees, now fully healed, formed a magnificent green canopy. The air was sweet with the scent of blossoms and damp earth. It was a sanctuary of peace, open to all who sought it. Queen Alara often walked its paths, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The kingdom was healing, and so was she. The scars on her back remained, a reminder of the fire she had survived, but the scars on her soul had been soothed by love and acceptance. Her voice, once a source of trauma, was now her greatest gift. She would often sing softly to the grove, her melodies carrying on the wind, a blessing to the land and its people. King Lycan ruled with a strength tempered by her compassion. He was still a formidable warrior and a shrewd leader, but the cold, ruthless edge was gone. He listened to his people, he dispensed justice with fairness, and he was loved, not just feared. The darkness of the curse was a distant memory, a shadow banished by the light of his mate. Their union had brought not just peace, but prosperity. With the grove thriving, the land itself had become more fertile. Harvests were bountiful. The harsh winters seemed less severe. Hope, once a foreign concept, had taken root in the hearts of the people. One afternoon, Lycan found Ilara in the grove, sitting on their stone bench by the spring. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, his hands resting protectively on her stomach. "How are my queen and my heir?" he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "We are well," she answered, leaning back against his solid chest. "I think he has your warrior spirit. And your stubbornness, I have no doubt." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a butterfly dance over a patch of winter roses. The world they had built together was peaceful, vibrant, and full of life. "Do you ever miss the silence?" he asked softly. Ilara considered the question. She thought of the years she had spent trapped in that quiet prison, and the freedom she now had in her voice. "No," she said, turning in his arms to face him. She cupped his scarred jaw, her thumb tracing the line of it. "The silence was never mine," she said, her voice full of love. "The life we have, the family we are making, this is what is truly mine." He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss full of promises kept and a future yet to be written. The former slave and the cursed king, the mute girl and the feared beast. They had found in each other not a cure for their brokenness, but the missing pieces that made them whole. Their love story, born in the shadows of a dying garden, had become the enduring legend of their land. A testament to the truth that even in the coldest, darkest of places, hope could still take root and bloom. And as the sun set, casting long, golden rays through the leaves of the thriving grove, the king and his queen held each other, their hearts beating as one, ready for the new life that was about to begin.